What's up guys, thanks so much for checking out the video. In today's video, I'm going to walk you guys through all the steps to take that factory cast intake manifold and paint it with a factory red STi crinkle coat finish. This is an awesome modification to do, and in my opinion, it's a huge upgrade to any engine bay. Thank you so much for checking out the video guys. I'm Luke, this is a SubaruONLY show. This is my little SubaruONLY shop. It's a DIY Subaru channel. It's a channel where all I do is Subaru builds and race Subaru vehicles and motorsport events. It's a DIY themed channel where I walk you guys through the steps to get your Subarus back on the road and hopefully do a little racing of your own. So thanks for checking out the video guys. I really appreciate it. This intake manifold is actually part of a build series where I'm rebuilding an EJ205 motor from a 2005 WRX, and I'm swapping that motor into my 1998 two-door RS Coupe. On this list behind me, I've broken this engine build series down to 12 steps where I'm making videos for each one of these steps. And as you can see behind me, I've actually already completed the first 3 steps, and that is to tear down the engine, to get the heads machined, and then to clean that short block engine assembly. Okay, so let's take a closer look at that intake manifold and let's walk through the game plan for painting this sucker with that red crinkle coat finish. Okay, to walk us through painting this intake manifold with that red crinkle coat finish, I've actually put together 7 steps on this whiteboard. The first step is going to be to take a bunch of pictures. Take them from every angle because you never know when you're going to forget something and you're going to need to refer to those pictures to get that sucker all put back together. The second step will be to remove that throttle body. That's a really straightforward step. There's typically only 4 bolts holding that throttle body, and I'm going to walk you guys through that process in a second. Step 3 is going to be to remove all the hoses and the turbo inlet. That's pretty straightforward, and we want to make sure we mark everything or label everything as we remove it. Then we'll move on to step number 4, which is to disconnect the fuel system. I'm going to walk you guys through this step, but basically we're going to start by removing the fuel rails first and then going from there. Step 5 is to remove the tumble generator valves, or the TGVs. That's pretty straightforward, and once we've got all the steps before it done, those suckers will come out really easily. Step 6 is going to be to clean and mask off this intake manifold. We want to clean all the oil and all the debris off this intake manifold because we want to have the paint have a really good surface to adhere to. And then of course, we also want to mask off a bunch of thread holes and a bunch of machine surfaces on this intake manifold because we don't want to have paint get everywhere. And step 7 will be to paint and dry the intake manifold. And for that step, we're pretty much going to follow the manufacturer's instructions, and then we're going to allow it to dry, and we're going to talk about what the curing process is. And then over here on the bottom right, I've actually put a little star by New Bolts. That's actually an additional upgrade you can do. It's a really, really nice final touch. And if you can replace all the hardware on this intake manifold when you put it back together, and you combine that with a new red crinkle coat finish, this intake manifold is going to look awesome on your new engine build. So that's the 7 steps, and I'm going to walk you guys through all 7 of these steps right now. Okay, step 1 was to take a bunch of pictures of your intake manifold. I went ahead and did that with this intake manifold, and I'm ready to move on to step 2, which is to remove this throttle body. Now to remove this throttle body, there's actually going to be 3 things you need to think about. You need to remove all the electrical plugs, you need to remove all the coolant hoses, and then you need to remove the 4 bolts that are holding it to that intake manifold. Now anytime you're going to remove these little electrical plugs from your throttle body, you want to depress the little plastic tang that's locking that plug to the sensor body. Okay, after you've removed all 3 of those plugs from your throttle body, go ahead and pull that section of the wiring loom away from the intake manifold. That way you can tuck it aside and you can get better access to remove that throttle body. Okay, after you've removed all those wiring harness plugs, move on to removing all the hoses that are going to that throttle body. These are actually going to be coolant hoses that are routed to that throttle body to help warm it under extremely cold conditions. A little set of bent needle nose pliers works great for removing these spring clamps. And then go ahead and loosen that hose before you try to pull it off. That way you can break the seal. Now even though I took a bunch of pictures, I'm also going to put a little tape on this. I'm going to mark this hose so I have a quick reference to where it came from when I go ahead and put it back together. It's a really good time saver. It only takes a couple seconds now, and it makes the build process go back together a lot quicker. And you remember you're going to have 2 hoses going to that throttle body, one for routing the coolant into the throttle body, and another hose for routing that coolant away from the throttle body. So mark both hoses, that way you know which one came from which port when you go ahead and put this sucker back together at the end. Okay, after you've gotten all those wiring harness plugs off and you have all the hoses removed, you go ahead and remove the 4 bolts that are holding this throttle body to the intake manifold. Those 4 bolts should be 12 millimeters. And then go ahead and pop that sucker off. It might be a little bit stuck to that intake manifold, but give it a little bit of gentle force and it'll pop right off, no problem. Okay, there we have it. There's a throttle body completely removed from the intake manifold. If you flip it over, you can see a better view of the backside of that throttle body. And here's actually that gasket. I'm going to replace the gasket. I always like to replace the gasket anytime I remove one of these throttle bodies and put it back on the engine. Okay, the next step is to remove all the miscellaneous hoses in that turbo inlet tube. To do that, I'm going to flip this intake manifold around so you guys can get a better view. Okay, now remember, you've already taken a bunch of pictures, but if you forgot to do that step, go ahead and take some more pictures right now of the way all these hoses are routed, because you want to refer to that when you put the sucker back together. At this point, go ahead and remove all these vacuum hoses that are connected to your intake manifold and to that turbo inlet, and get that entire system of hoses out of the way. And again, remember, anytime you're going to remove any of these hoses, you want to twist them first to break that seal, and then pull them off. Kind of like this. Boom. It actually helps to remove any of those little sensors and actually put those sensors back on those hoses and try to keep as much of that vacuum hose assembly together as one unit. Here's an example of keeping all those vacuum hoses and that sensor all in one place. This is a little sensor that's monitoring the vacuum pressure inside of these hoses. So keep all these hoses attached to that little sensor and put it aside. That way you don't lose track of the way they're connected. That turbo inlet is actually going to be held in with a little rounded 6mm Allen bolt. So go ahead and grab a 6mm Allen fitting, throw it on a ratchet, and remove that little bolt. Okay, now that you have that turbo inlet loosened, you can either remove it now, or you can wait until you've removed the rest of the components and it will drop right out at the end. Okay, after you flip this intake manifold over, you want to remove all the bolts that are holding the fuel lines to the underside of that intake manifold. And then there's also going to be a couple bolts that are holding a little cradle for the wiring harness. Remove those bolts as well. We're going to move all the bolts and all the hardware from the underside of this intake manifold. Okay, once you remove those two 12mm bolts that are holding that wiring harness cradle and the wiring harness to the underside of that intake manifold, you should be able to snake all those plugs and the wiring harness away from that intake manifold and completely remove it and set it aside. Okay, and there's our entire wiring harness from our intake manifold. Let's set this aside and let's move on to the next step. So go ahead and flip that intake manifold back over and let's remove the bolts that are holding the fuel rails down to the intake manifold. Okay, to get this fuel rail disconnected from your intake manifold, all you need to do is remove these two 12mm bolts that are holding that fuel rail down. And then make sure you remove all the little miscellaneous bolts. There's actually another bolt right here on the side of the intake manifold that's still holding those hard lines down to the intake manifold. Okay, after you removed all the hardware that's holding these fuel rails and those fuel lines down to your intake manifolds, you should be able to gently lift those fuel rails up and separate the injectors from the bottom of those tumble generator valves. Because the next step is to remove these tumble generator valves from this whole assembly. At this point, you can lift those rails up and slide each one of those injectors out so you can clean them and package them up in an airtight bag. Because these fuel injectors need to be completely clean and free of any debris when we go to reinstall them at the end. Yeah, and be ready to dump a little fuel when you do this process. Once you got the first side out, it makes it a little bit easier to work out the second side. You actually want to clean everything and reinstall it carefully, and if possible, you want to replace any of the seals that look like they've hardened over time. Now before we go ahead and try to snake these fuel lines completely away from this intake manifold, we want to go ahead and take those tumble generator valves out first. So go ahead and remove all those little 10mm bolts that are holding that tumble generator valve assembly to the intake manifold. That way, it'll be easier to remove the rest of these fuel lines and these fuel rails from the intake manifold. Okay, once you've removed all those 10mm bolts that are holding that tumble generator valve assembly to your intake manifold, it should be no problem to slide that sucker off and completely set it aside. Okay, and there's that tumble generator assembly. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing to the other side. I'm going to remove the 10mm bolts that are holding that sucker down and remove both of these tumble generator valve assemblies. Okay, and there's the second tumble generator valve assembly. And when you remove both of these tumble generator valve assemblies, everything else should really start to drop off of this intake manifold and be easy to remove. Okay, now that we have that tumble generator valve assembly out, that turbo inlet comes right on out, no problem, no forcing, no worrying about weaving it through things and breaking off any of these little vacuum ports. It's definitely best to leave this turbo inlet to the very end. That way, you make sure you don't damage anything when you're trying to remove it. Okay, now that those tumble generator valves are off, the fuel line assembly is almost completely off, but you still have to remove one thing on the driver's side, and that's this section right here. You actually have to separate these two sections of hardline. That way you can completely remove that fuel rail assembly and remove all the rest of the hard lines from your intake manifold. So just slowly work that fuel line off and then completely disassemble that fuel line assembly from that intake manifold. Now that I've got this one separated, I can completely remove the rest of these fuel lines. Okay, and this fuel line assembly is completely removed. I'm going to set it aside, clean it, and then reinstall it at a later time. Okay, this intake manifold is virtually completely stripped down. It's looking really, really good. Now all we need to do is remove all the bolts and all these little brackets from this intake manifold and completely strip it down so there's nothing left but the bare metal for us to clean, tape off, and then paint. Alright, this intake manifold is totally stripped down and we're ready to grab a bucket of hot soapy water. Let's totally soak this sucker down and remove all the oily film and all the debris that's on this intake manifold. That way we prep the surface of this cast aluminum manifold to have a really good adhesion with a red crinkle coat paint we're going to use. Okay, let's take this sucker outside to soak in that hot soapy water and get all that oily debris off. Okay, I got the intake manifold right here. I got a bucket of hot soapy water right here, and we're gonna go ahead and totally soak this sucker down and degrease it as much as we can. Alright guys, after you've scrubbed that sucker down with hot soapy water and you've allowed it to completely dry, we're going to bring it inside. I'm going to do one final step. I'm going to wipe it down with mineral spirits or acetone. It's a great final step to do anytime you're going to paint anything. You're also going to want to grab a pair of gloves because there's actually oils on your hands that'll get onto the surface of the part you're about to paint. So throw some gloves on, grab some mineral spirits or some acetone or something equivalent, grab a microfiber rag, and go ahead and give that intake manifold one more wipe down. Okay, I've wiped it down with that mineral spirit. I'm going to give it a few minutes to dry, and then I'm going to start the masking and the taping process. I'm going to show you guys a couple of quick hints that I use anytime that I'm going to mask up or tape up any parts that have a bunch of bolt holes like this one. Okay, when it comes time to masking and taping off all the machine surfaces and all the areas that you don't want to have paint on, I'm going to go ahead and use two different products. I'm going to use my blue painter's tape, like I do for most of my painting jobs. You'll use that blue painter's tape for anywhere where you have a lot of surface area, like where that throttle body bolts up. And then for a lot of the other small miscellaneous holes, I actually grab my assortment of body clips. These work great, they have an assortment of sizes, and they're really quick and easy to pop in and remove at the end. So let's go ahead and start taping this sucker off. Okay, the trick here is to lay down a layer of that blue painter's tape and then take a sharp razor blade and go around the perimeter of that machine surface that you're trying to cover up and remove all that excess tape really cleanly and easily. Okay, this is about what it should look like. If you take your time and you have a really sharp razor blade, this process will go really easily, and you make a nice layer completely covering that machine surface or any of the other surfaces that you want to protect from that paint. Okay, next let's move on to the bottom and we'll cover up both these ports the same way. Okay guys, this is looking really good. I've used that blue painter's tape and I've covered up a lot of these ports and I'm just about done. Now there's actually a few more ports I'm going to cover up. There's these ports along the bottom, and for those I'm actually going to use these plastic clips that pop right in, because it's a lot easier to get into those small little crevices like in here with those plastic clips to cover up those bolt holes. And then on the bottom here, there's one more port and I'm just going to put a big bolt in that thread hole. That way none of those threads get any paint in them, but I get as much coverage as I can around those thread holes. Okay, here's one of these little plastic clips that I have from this little assortment package. This one's one of the smaller size ones, and this goes in those small little bolt holes at the bottom right here. That little plastic clip fits right in there, fits really nice and perfect. That way you don't have to struggle with trying to cut around the tape and make a perfect little round cutout with that razor blade in that blue painter's tape. This works a hell of a lot easier and it's a hell of a lot faster. Because at the end of the day, this is going to take quite a bit of time, and the more time you put in, the better the paint job is going to look at the end. Okay, that's kind of what I'm talking about. You can see I'm using those black plastic clips to plug all those little holes on the bottom of this intake manifold. Those work really well, and as you can see, they cover those holes perfectly with that round shape. I'm gonna go ahead and do the other side right now. Alright, this sucker is all taped up, it's all masked up, every port is covered, and I'm ready to go ahead and start the painting process. So let's walk through the instructions to lay down that red crinkle coat paint. Okay, here's a product that we're going to use to put the red crinkle coat finish on this intake manifold. It's a VHT brand product. It's their high temperature red crinkle coat finish. Now the instructions are on the back, and if you read the instructions, what they basically say is to remove all the oil and the rust and debris from the surface you're going to paint, and we've already done that, and then tape it off and mask it off. That's what we've already done as well. And then use it in temperatures between 60 degrees Fahrenheit and 95 degrees Fahrenheit with relative humidity below 60 degrees. I'm here in Northern California, and the temperature and the humidity is definitely within those ranges, so I definitely don't have to worry about any of those conditions. Another thing you might want to consider is if you're in really cold temperatures, you also want to heat up the metal surface. As a matter of fact, anytime you're going to do any painting, if you heat up that metal surface, that'll actually open up the pores of that metal surface, and that'll allow that painting product to make a more complete adhesion to that surface. But for me, since I'm in relatively warm conditions here in Northern California, I'm just going to go ahead and follow the instructions and do exactly as the instructions say. Now the way we're going to lay this paint down is we're actually going to apply it in perpendicular layers. And what I mean by that is the path in which I lay this paint down. I'm going to lay it down the intake manifold horizontally first in one light coat, and then I'm going to lay it down vertically to the surface in another light coat, and then I'll actually do it at a diagonal in a little bit heavier coat. That way we actually do 3 consecutive coats. The first 2 coats are going to be light coat, and then the last coat will be heavy coat. And each one of those coats is actually sprayed on the intake manifold from a different angle. That way you get more complete coverage, and you'll actually end up with a better finished product at the end of the process. So let's go ahead and shake this can up, and then we'll lay down that first light coat, and then wait 5 minutes before we start the second coat. Okay guys, here's my little makeshift paint booth. That's right, it's ghetto, it's made of cardboard, but it's gonna work. It's gonna block the wind, and it's gonna provide a nice little ventilated, protected area where I can lay down these paint coats. All right, go ahead and lay that first coat down, horizontal pattern. Alright, that's a good first coat. It's a light coat, and then we'll go over it perpendicular to that for the second coat, and we'll do that second coat also a light coat. And then for the third coat, that was going to be the heavy coat. So I'll go ahead and give it 5 minutes to dry before we go ahead and start that second coat. Okay, it's been 5 minutes, and I've flipped this intake around so we can lay our first coat on the back side. Okay, that's a good first coat for the backside. Remember, we're trying to avoid having any runs. And when you do light coats, that's when you avoid having the runs. And after the first and the second light coat, the surface becomes real tacky, which allows you to apply a heavy coat for that third coat and not have any of those runs. Okay, that's good for now. We're gonna give it 5 minutes, and then we're gonna flip it around and apply the second light coat. Okay, it's been another 5 minutes, and I've flipped that intake manifold back around. I'm gonna go ahead and apply my second coat, which is also gonna be a light coat, but I'm going to do it in a perpendicular direction to that first coat. Alright, I think that's good for that second coat, so I'll give it another 5 minutes, and then we'll flip it around. We'll do the second coat on the back side and the underside from the back, and then we'll get ready to do our third heavy coat. So far, this intake manifold is looking great, and I haven't had any runs whatsoever. Alright, let's get the sucker flipped around. I'm gonna be careful with it now that we're starting to have a nice finish. Another thing I'll mention, you guys probably noticed I'm using the cap of that paint can to use as a little prop, so I get that part propped up and get underneath it a little better. Okay, that's good for that second coat on the back side of this intake manifold, so we'll go ahead and wait another 5 minutes. Then I'm going to flip this thing around, and I'm going to start my third coat. That'll be the final coat and the heavy coat on the front side, and then I'll do the back side, and then this intake manifold is going to be done. The sucker's looking really good. There's still no runs whatsoever on this intake manifold. And remember, you want to do light coats, that way you can get the surface real tacky for that third and final coat. Alright, it's been 5 minutes, so I'm going to flip this thing around, and let's go ahead and get that third coat laid down.
Alright, that looks good. We're ready to go. We're going to do this third coat. Okay, I think that is looking awesome. I'm going to give that 5 minutes. I'm going to flip it around and do the third and final coat for the back side of this intake manifold. And then we're going to take it back inside the shop and let it dry. Okay guys, I carefully brought this intake manifold into the shop and I've laid it down here on my workshop bench. Now the instructions on the paint can say to give it 2 hours to air dry and then give it another 24 hours before you make any contact with the surface, and give it a full 48 hours before you install it back in your vehicle. Now in addition to those guidelines, they also suggest that you cure this wrinkle coat by baking it at 200 degrees for a minimum of 2 hours. Now a lot of people just install these intake manifolds or other parts back in their vehicles and then run those vehicles for a couple hours in a well-ventilated area like on the freeway or some other area, because this paint is actually going to off-gas a bunch of potentially toxic odors during that curing process. So you don't want to cure this thing in a closed garage, and you don't want to cure it in your oven that you use to prepare food. But before this intake manifold sits for the next 24 hours, I'm actually going to go ahead and remove that blue painter's tape, because it's easier to remove it now while the paint is still tacky than later once the paint is completely set and hardened up. So go ahead and get a little tool like a little razor blade or a little screwdriver and carefully remove all the blue painter's tape and all the other areas that you masked off or taped off. When you're doing this, be careful and make sure you don't gouge or make any scratches in the machine surface of that intake manifold. You can see that these small round plastic plugs really work perfect to cover those small round bolt holes. Using these plastic plugs really makes it nice at the end because they slide out so quick and easy. Okay guys, that is it. This intake manifold is painted with the factory red crinkle coat finish. I think it looks amazing. This is one of the nicest ones I've ever done, as a matter of fact. There's not a single little run on this sucker, and it's going to look beautiful. Now when you read the instructions, you also find that the wrinkle coat actually develops more fully as the paint completely cures. So if you don't see a whole lot of wrinkles right in the beginning, don't worry. If you have a nice, clean, even coat, that intake manifold is going to end up looking great. Thank you so much for checking out the video, guys. If you have any questions or comments, please leave it in the comment section. I'm Luke. This is the SubaruONLY channel. Until next time, guys. Later!